the five biggest black drug kingpins of the 1960s and 70s. Harlem, late 1960s. The streets were alive with soul music, neon lights, and the rhythm of a new black identity rising in America. But beneath that vibrance, another empire was being built. One, not in City Hall, not on Wall Street, but in the shadows. Drugs were about to reshape entire communities. And at the center of it all stood men who became legends. Men who built multi-million-dollar empires from heroin and cocaine, rivaling the Mafia and rewriting the rules of organized crime. Some lived flashy, others vanished without a trace. Some betrayed everything they stood for. This is the untold story of the five biggest black drug kingpins of the 1960s and 70s. Frank Lucas, the American gangster. Frank Lucas's story begins far from Harlem. He was born in 1930 in LaGrange, North Carolina, into poverty. He often told the story of watching his 12-year-old cousin murdered by the Ku Klux Klan for looking at a white woman. That moment burned in him a desire for money and power, the kind that would shield him from ever being vulnerable again. In the 1940s, Lucas left the South for Harlem, where he was taken under the wing of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the legendary Harlem gangster who kept peace between black hustlers and the Italian Mafia. Lucas studied Bumpy's every move, learning how Harlem worked, how the mob taxed everyone, and how the real money wasn't in street hustles, but in narcotics. When Bumpy died in 1968, Harlem was left without a leader. The Italians thought they'd control the heroin flow, but Lucas made a bold move. He cut them out. Instead of paying Mafia prices, he went directly to the source. With connections in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War, Lucas established a direct heroin pipeline. He claimed he used the coffins of dead U.S. soldiers to smuggle pure heroin back into America, a story debated to this day, but powerful enough to build his legend. His brand was Blue Magic, a product purer and cheaper than anything the streets had ever seen. Lucas built an empire. At his peak, he claimed he made $1 million a day. He owned a ranch in North Carolina, a mansion in New Jersey, and properties in Puerto Rico. He lived like royalty, but he also played the part of Harlem's Robin Hood, handing out turkeys at Thanksgiving and throwing lavish parties that made him a folk hero. But no one is untouchable. In 1975, the DEA raided his New Jersey home, finding over $500,000 in cash hidden under his bed. Facing decades in prison, Lucas flipped. He testified against corrupt cops and fellow traffickers, destroying his own network in the process. His betrayal left Harlem stunned. Lucas spent years in prison before being released, only to return later for new charges. His story, though, would be immortalized in 2007's American Gangster, turning him into a cultural icon, a man who both rose as a king and fell as an informant. Nicky Barnes, Mr. Untouchable. If Frank Lucas built his empire through connections overseas, Leroy Nicky Barnes built his through discipline and organization. Barnes was born in Harlem in 1933. By his teenage years, he was already in and out of reform schools, addicted to heroin himself. But prison changed him. Behind bars, he kicked his addiction, studied law, and prepared himself for power. When he hit the streets in the late 1960s, Barnes brought a new level of professionalism to Harlem's heroin game. He founded the Council, a syndicate of 7 trusted men who each controlled their own territory but shared profits and decisions. It was Harlem's version of the Mafia Commission. Barnes saw the council not just as a gang, but as a government of the streets. Nicky's style was as famous as his drugs. He wore custom-tailored suits, drove flashy cars, and loved the spotlight. He became a Harlem celebrity, so much so that in 1977, the New York Times Magazine put him on the cover with the headline, Mr. Untouchable. That cover enraged President Jimmy Carter, who ordered prosecutors to bring Barnes down at all costs. But it wasn't the law that destroyed Nicky, it was betrayal. While Barnes sat in prison, members of the council disrespected him, sleeping with his women and stealing his money. Enraged, Barnes turned on everyone. He became a federal informant, testifying against dozens of his former partners. Barnes's testimony shattered Harlem's drug world. The council crumbled, and Nicky disappeared into witness protection. For decades, his whereabouts were unknown, until it was revealed he had quietly lived out his life before dying in 2012. Barnes's story is the ultimate gangster tragedy. He rose as Harlem's king, but in the end, he destroyed his own empire out of revenge. Frank Matthews, Black Caesar. Among Harlem legends, one man's story stands apart. Frank Matthews, the man known as Black Caesar. Born in Durham, North Carolina in 1944, Matthews came up hustling numbers and small-time crime. By the late 1960s, he had moved to New York, where he quickly rose through the underworld. Unlike Lucas and Barnes, Matthews didn't just want Harlem, he wanted the entire East Coast. Matthews was one of the first major black traffickers to deal directly with international suppliers. He bypassed the Mafia, buying heroin and cocaine from Cuban suppliers and Corsican syndicates. By the early 1970s, his network stretched from New York to Miami, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and beyond. Authorities estimate Matthews pulled in more than $100 million during his reign. He wasn't just rich, he was feared. Mafia families saw him as a rival, but Matthews had muscle, money, and connections that kept him safe. But in 1973, the empire came crashing down. Matthews was arrested and charged with drug trafficking. Released on bail, he was scheduled to appear in court. Instead, he vanished. Along with his girlfriend at an estimated $15, $20 million in cash, Matthews disappeared into history. No one has ever found him. No body. No confirmed sighting. Some believe he fled to Africa, others say South America, and some insist he was killed. But the truth remains one of the great mysteries in American crime. Matthews's disappearance sealed his legend. While Lucas and Barnes became infamous for snitching, Matthews walked away from it all, vanishing like a ghost, leaving behind a story still whispered in the streets. Ike Atkinson, Sergeant Smack. While Lucas, Barnes, and Matthews ran Harlem, another figure quietly built one of the most important drug pipelines of the era. Ike Atkinson, known as Sergeant Smack, wasn't your typical gangster. He was a U.S. Army Master Sergeant stationed in Thailand during the Vietnam War. Atkinson saw opportunity in chaos. With American troops flooding Asia, heroin was cheap and plentiful. Using military contacts, Atkinson created a pipeline that funneled heroin into the United States. Furniture, military equipment, and cargo shipments became his vehicles. The famous coffin story often attributed to Frank Lucas. Many insiders say it was Atkinson's operation, not Lucas's. Atkinson's genius was in his discretion. Unlike Lucas, he didn't flaunt his wealth. Unlike Barnes, he didn't seek the spotlight. He lived quietly, reinvesting money and keeping operations disciplined. At his peak, his pipeline was worth tens of millions, fueling Harlem's heroin epidemic. But even Atkinson couldn't escape the law. In 1975, he was arrested and eventually sentenced to 31 years in prison. He served nearly 3 decades before being released in the early 2000s. Though Lucas became the Hollywood star, insiders know Atkinson was the real architect of the Asian heroin trade, a man whose military precision made him one of the most effective traffickers in American history. Freeway, Ricky Ross, the crack era begins. As the 1970s ended, heroin's grip on Harlem loosened. Cocaine was the new king. And in Los Angeles, a young man named Ricky Donald Ross, better known as Freeway Rick, was about to usher in a new era. Ross was born in Texas in 1960, but raised in South Central LA. He was a talented tennis player with college dreams, but when those fell apart, he turned to the streets. By the late 1970s, Ross discovered cocaine, and with the arrival of crack, he became a kingpin. Ross's genius wasn't just in selling drugs, it was in scale. He built a network that stretched across Los Angeles and beyond, selling millions of dollars of crack daily. At his peak, Ross was making up to $3 million a day. But Ross's story came with a darker twist. His suppliers were tied to Nicaraguan Contra rebels who were backed by the CIA. The Iran-Contra scandal revealed that Ross's empire was indirectly funded by U.S. pump-all, nude indirectly. Intelligence, fueling the crack epidemic that devastated black communities across America. In 1996, Ross was arrested in a DEA sting and sentenced to life. His sentence was later reduced, and he was released in 2009. Since then, he has reinvented himself as a motivational speaker, warning young people about the game that once made him rich. Ross's empire marked the transition from heroin to crack, from Harlem to LA, but the cycle remained the same: wealth, power, betrayal, and downfall. Conclusion: Frank Lucas, Nicky Barnes, Frank Matthews, Ike Atkinson, Freeway, Ricky Ross. Each man's story is different, but together, they tell the tale of a generation of hustlers who rewrote America's underworld. Lucas brought heroin from Asia. Barnes built a corporate-style syndicate. Matthews reached for nationwide control before vanishing into legend. Atkinson quietly engineered the heroin pipeline. And Ross ushered in the crack era, tied to politics bigger than the streets themselves. They were hustlers, visionaries, and criminals all at once. They rose higher than anyone thought possible, but in the end, every empire fell. Some to the law, some to betrayal. And some, like Frank Matthews, disappeared into history, leaving only questions behind. This was the rise and fall of the 5 biggest black drug kingpins of the 1960s and 70s legends, who lived fast, died young, or simply vanished. Forever remembered as kings of an empire built in the shadows.